Now, when you see the term or the word expression in math, it just means a mathematical statement. So just some numbers with addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, and sometimes parentheses. And by reading the expression, which is going to be some words, you will need to write down what the mathematical statement is. And so we need to be able to write down these things and be able to read a set of words, understand what it means, and write down the math. Now, before we get to some problems, I'm going to show you a few quick keywords that will make your job easier. When you see something like the sum of two numbers, it always means to add things together. So it's not the only time you need to add things together, but a lot of times they'll use the word sum, right? When you see the word difference, okay, something like this, difference. If you see difference, that means to subtract, right? The difference between two things, the difference between two ages, the difference between two lengths, whatever. Let me switch colors here. If you see something like the product of two numbers, or when some number is 3 times another number, these words mean multiply. So a lot of times you'll say, hey, the product of 3 and 7, or this car is 3.5 times bigger than another car. Those mean multiplication. And then finally, the last one I'll share with you is if you see the word quotient, or you see the word divided, usually like divided by, of course these mean division. So these are not the only words that can trigger these things, but these are the most common ones. So be on the lookout for words like the sum of, or sometimes you'll see all together, like, you know, Jenny has 5 marbles and Jake has 10 marbles. How many do they have all together? That can also mean addition. But usually you'll see the word sum. Or if you see the word difference, what is the difference between these two things? You're subtracting. If you're seeing product or times, it's multiplying. If you're seeing quotient or divided by, it's almost always division. So keep that in mind as we solve these problems that we're about to do here, because what we're going to do is I'm going to read you a statement, and you'll be able to read the statement yourself, and we need to figure out how to write it down in terms of math operations. Write down the expression. So the first one is 8 times the amount of 2. It's a pretty simple statement, 8 times the amount of 2. Notice the word times in there tells us that when we're writing this down, 8 times the amount of 2, the way that we do that is 8 times 2. Not a huge surprise that it would be just 8 times 2, since that's what we read, okay? The next one would be the difference between 10 and 3. The difference between 10 and 3. So if we're going to write that, the word difference should trigger in your mind subtraction. So the difference between 10 and 3 is going to be written 10 minus 3. You would not want to write it as 3 minus 10 because that's not really possible. You can't really do 3 minus 10. You don't have enough to subtract, so it needs to be 10 minus 3. Now another way you might see subtraction is, for instance, the next one, 18 decreased by 6. You think about it, the idea of decreasing something means to subtract. So if we have 18 decreased by 6, 18 decreased by 6 would be 18 minus 6. So far all of these are just single operations. All right, but what if we had something like 7 increased by 17? So if you're decreasing, you're taking something away. If you're increasing, then you're adding something. So for one like that, it would be 7 increased by 17 would be 7 plus 17. Now here in the following problems, they get a little bit more complicated. Not really complicated, but a little more complicated. So I'm going to go ahead and switch my colors out here. What if we have 5 times the difference between 7 and 4? 5 times the difference between 7 and 4. All right. Now, a lot of students would write that like this, 5 times the difference between 7 and 4. We know that we're going to have 5, and we know that we're going to have times, and then you read that we have the difference between 7 and 4, so you know that's subtraction. So a lot of students will write it like that, 5 times the difference between 7 and 4. But that's actually not totally correct, because if you think about it, the order of operations, well, the problem is saying that first we're taking the difference between 7 and 4, all right? And then we're multiplying that by 5 because it's 5 times whatever the difference is. So we have to find the difference first. Now the way it's written, if you do order of operations, you would do the multiplication first and then the subtraction. So that's not really what we want. We want to force the difference to happen first. The way you do that is by adding parentheses. And this is the first real example I can show you of when parentheses are important in math. If I wanted to calculate 5 times the difference between 7 and 4, the way to do it is to make the subtraction happen first. So we put it in parentheses, so this will happen first. The difference will be done first, then we multiply by 5. All right? So as we go through here, the rest of these problems are going to have parentheses in there, so start to think about where the parentheses would go to make sense for what you're trying to calculate. What if we have the product of 2 and 4 decreased by 6? The product of 2 and 4 decreased by 6. All right? There's a couple ways to write this, but the clearest way is to say 2 times 4. We're taking the product first, and we're decreasing it by 3. The product of 2 and 4 decreased by 3. All right? So we want to do the product first. Now in this particular case, even without the parentheses, we would still be doing the product first and then doing the subtraction. But I think it's clearer since the product is saying, since the question is saying the product of 2 and 4, we want to do that first, decreased by 6. This is the cleanest way to write that. Now the next one is, what if we have the sum of 2 and 6 divided by 4? The sum of 2 and 6 divided by 4. So we know we have a sum going on of 2 and 6, so let's write that down. And we know we're dividing by 4, but does this really express what we're trying to do? It says the sum of 2 and 6 is what we're dividing by 4. We're dividing the sum by 2 and 4. So we need to do the sum first, and then we do the division. We have to put the parentheses here. If we don't put the parentheses here, without parentheses, you're going to do the division first in your order of operations, and then your addition last. That's not what you want. The problem says the sum of 2 and 6, we have to find the sum, then we divide by 4. So you need to read these things carefully to understand what we're asking. The next one says the quotient of 30 divided by 6 increased by 3. The quotient of 30 divided by 6 increased by 3. So there's two nice keywords. Quotient means division. Divided by also means division. But in any case, we're doing the quotient first and then we're dividing by 3. So probably the easiest way to represent what we're doing there is we're saying 30 divided by 6 increased by 3. Okay? We want to make sure and do the division first, then we're increasing the result by 3. Now, again, in this particular case, even without the parentheses, we would have to do the division first, but adding the parentheses here makes sure that everybody reads it, knows that this has to be done first before we add the 3. All right? So the next problem is the sum of 14 and 22 divided by 9. The sum of 14 and 22 divided by 9. So clearly we're trying to do the sum first, and then after we do that, we're trying to do the division by 9. So you want to use parentheses, 14 plus 22, and then you get the result of that and you divide by 9. Now you have to do it this way because if I took these parentheses away, then the 22 divided by 9 would have to be done first in the order of operations, and then we would do the plus, the addition. But since I put the parentheses there, it forces me to do this addition first, which is what I'm trying to do. The sum of 14 and 22 divided by 9. So we're forcing the sum to happen first with this. All right, the last one is we're decreasing the product of 11 and 2 by 8. So the word product means multiplication, and we're decreasing the product by 8. So what it's basically telling us here is we're having a product of 11 and 2, and then we're decreasing the product by 8. Right? So we put the parentheses here to clearly indicate that we want to do the product first of 11 and 2, and then we're decreasing that by 8. In this particular case, even if you remove the parentheses, you'd still have to do the multiplication first, then subtract the 8. But I think it's still clearer when you're translating these sentences into math. Put the parentheses in place to force whatever you want to happen first, just to be absolutely clear to anybody reading